going to turn the floor over to Lee. Before I do that, Lee works at Forte Group. We would like to thank the Forte Group for sponsoring our pre-conference social last night. As many of you know, Forte is a software engineering firm with a long-term focus on quality engineering practices. And if you want to find out more about Forte, Lee Barnes, who's about to speak, their Chief Quality Officer and one of our speakers next in this room, is here and we'll be happy to talk to you. So that's Forte Group. Now a few words about Lee. Lee is the Chief Quality Officer at Forte, as I just mentioned. He has over 30 years of experience in the software quality assurance industry and testing field. He's been involved with the implementation of test automation in performance testing initiatives, excuse me, in hundreds of environments across a wide array of industries. More recently, Lee has been involved with bringing quality practices with a focus on automation and performance to DevOps teams. There's way more because he has a storied and amazing career, but he wanted to get to his talk. So without further ado, Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremiah. All right, well, thanks everyone for taking the time to, of course, come to the conference, but attend this talk. This talk is designed for a little bit longer time slot. I didn't delete any slides, but I might gloss over a few, like my intro, since Jeremiah did such a great job. I do think, though, it makes sense to give a quick background on my journey into software testing and give a little bit of a lens into my perspective and why I might have some of the opinions that I have and I'm about to espouse to you. I'm going to give you the short version. I started out in aerospace engineering, spent a lot of time doing independent verification and validation, which is a fancy word for we would essentially test the analyses that other aerospace companies did for whatever they were producing, typically for Department of Defense. And our job was to find not just the most important problems or the superficial problems, but all the problems. So we dug very deeply into their analyses. So we were essentially testing their analyses. So I learned a lot about how to inspect and how to explore and how to look for problems that didn't appear that they may be there. But then after a few years, I moved over to IT with a large consulting company and was really uninspired by what they called software testing. Very shallow testing, really consisting of just executing scripted test steps and nothing beyond that. And to the point I was almost going to change careers, but I found some thought leaders in the space. So I'm talking about Boris Beiser and Brian Merrick, Sem Kainer, and others who treated software testing more like an engineering discipline and a scientific discipline, which is what I was much more used to than just this kind of superficial, rudimentary IT activity. So that prompted me to go further, and I evolved certainly my approach to software testing and eventually test automation based on further research and of course, some of my experiences. And so that's really kind of how I approach software testing and test automation from a much more scientific engineering discipline. But also, if you've seen any of my other talks, when I talk about test automation, it has one common theme, and that's value. Right? I see a lot of, as we'll see here in the slides, a lot of automation for the sake of automation, and unfortunately not a lot of focus on value. So as a leadership track here, I think as quality leaders, we can do a lot to improve the state of automation by making sure our teams are focusing on the value. So, going the wrong way. Let's start by looking at what effective software testing is. This is a definition that I have of software testing. It talks about things like critical thinking, knowledge, experimentation, right? Not executing scripted test steps. And if we take that further and qualify what effective software testing is, the number one thing is it's aligned with business goals and risks, right? I hopefully not anyway, as quality leaders, we're not encourage our teams just to test for the sake of testing, right? We're trying to get quality software out the door to achieve some business goal, and software testing should support that. It's got to be reliable, right? If it's not reliable, no one's going to trust the results, and that's even more so in automation when we don't have human eyes on those executions. It better provide us information that we can use to judge the quality of the software that we're shipping. Again, I see a lot of testing for the sake of testing and automation for the sake of automation with less value on the information that we're getting back. And again, our job as quality leaders to give our teams the time and the space to make that happen. And of course, it needs to support the requirement of fast feedback, where automation certainly comes in to help support us. So let's take a look now. If we can agree that, that's what software testing is, and the purpose of it is to find problems in software, let's take a look at the current state of test automation. This is from, I think, the 2023 World Quality Report. And no surprises, right? Maintainability at the top of the list in terms of what are the top 3 factors in determining your test automation approach. What's most surprising, though, is the data that I wasn't showing you, and that's that the value realized from test automation was at the bottom. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm happy that it's on the list, but in my opinion, it should be at the top. Why are we doing anything, test automation or otherwise, if we're not striving towards some value, right? Why isn't that driving our approach? So, and I think that the same environment that caused this not to be at the top of the list also perpetuates very common test automation myths, which again, as quality leaders, I think we need to do a better job of not perpetuating. Right? First one, test automation is a tool. Right? And this is, I think, born out of the tool vendors 30 years ago saying, hey, you've got a lot of testing problems, I've got a tool, and it's going to take all those testing problems away. And engineering leaders and IT leaders who were burdened by huge test burdens, they bought that, right? They were looking for a way out, and that myth continues to be perpetuated. But test automation is a process. It's not a tool. The tools enable that process, but they're not the silver bullet. We can automate 100% of our tests or any arbitrary percentage of our tests, right? My snarky answer is we should automate 100% of the tests that should be automated, right? The key is figuring out what tests those are, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But if we set some arbitrary metric for our teams, guess what? They're going to march toward that metric and ignore everything else, including the value that they're providing. Automated testing will find more problems than a human tester. If that's the case, you've got a lot of problems in your development cycle. If you keep executing the same test over and over again and it keeps finding more problems, you've got a lot of issues. And it probably has nothing to do with testing. Finally, that test automation is just automating user steps at the UI level. And we're getting much better about this, granted, but if 100% of your automation is at the UI level, you're probably doing something wrong in 2024. Slowest, most unreliable method of automation. So something must be missing, right? If the state of automation isn't where we want it to be, certainly as quality leaders, and there's exceptions, right? I'm sure there's people in this room that have phenomenal performing test automation teams within their delivery teams. But I have the benefit of going to a lot of organizations, and certainly across the board, the majority are not enjoying that situation. So what's missing? In my estimation, it's objectives. And again, it's the right objectives, all right? Counting metrics like percentage of tests automated or number of tests automated, in my experience, aren't the correct objectives. And bad objectives almost every time will lead to automation for the sake of automation. And organizations very often don't even understand that they're not getting the value, right? They're achieving the metrics, they're delivering software of some quality that's acceptable, but they don't see what's missing, right? So how did we get here? And I think it's because we asked the wrong questions, and this is very similar to some of those myths that I talked about. We start by asking, what tool should we use? Again, we're not even thinking about the value we want to add. We're just, what tool should we use? What framework should I use? What percentage of tests should we automate? Right? I'm going to harp on that quite a bit. What types of tests should we automate? Are these questions that have to be answered at some point? Yes. But I think they're the wrong questions. We should be asking, how can test automation support our development goals and by extension, our business goals? So if you agree with me that we're not in the best state in terms of test automation, let's take a look then what effective test automation looks like. As I just mentioned, supports software development and business goals. It is applied to high-value activities and tests. And I say activities on purpose, right? I see so many organizations that just focus automation on existing scripted test steps. But as we'll see in a couple slides, there's a lot of other things we do related to software testing that if we broaden our definition a little bit, we can be much more effective. It needs to be reliable and provide fast feedback. We need to be able to trust the results, and we need to get feedback in a way that we understand what happened. If tests fail, we shouldn't have this huge analysis cycle. It should be very clear what happened. Is it a problem with the environment, a problem with the data, a problem with the test itself, or do I actually have a problem with my application? Continuous improvement, this is a big one. I see a lot of organizations that treat test automation as a fire and forget solution, right? Test suite, it runs, I see those green check marks every day, but over time, no one really understands exactly what's in there in terms of the value it provides, in terms of what's being tested. So apply your culture of continuous improvement to test automation as well. You're going to find better ways of doing things. Technology is going to advance, as we just learned about, and your business goals may change, right? And that may impact how you approach things. It should allow testers to focus on high-value activities, right? I've been in so many conversations where someone told me, hey, I need to implement test automation because I have to reduce my headcount on my test team. I've never, in 30 years, seen that done successfully. Because if that was their goal, they were probably taking the wrong approach. They never succeeded. What has succeeded, though, is allowing your high-value testers to focus on high-value activity. Absolutely. So I want to take a little time and address some of those subpoints there about what effective test automation is. Again, it's a leadership track, so I'm going to keep it a little bit higher level, so we can get done on time and have a few minutes for questions at least. So I found a good way to identify high-value tests is to use this acronym FITR. I got it from Bas Dijkstra, who's a test automation expert out of the Netherlands, and I've got the link there to the article that I gleaned this from. It stands for focused, informative, trustworthy, and repeatable. Repeatable. Focus means we're testing as close to the target of the test as possible. We're not testing everything through the UI, right? So understand what the focus of your test is and execute it, or design it and execute it in the most efficient manner. Informative. Make sure it understands its intent and also that it communicates very clearly, as we just talked about, what happened, right? We don't want long analysis cycles. We're completely losing the value that we're gaining in the first place that way. Trustworthy, right? We've got to be able to trust the results. We don't want false positives or false negatives. And finally, repeatable. If these tests are going to be part of a continuous integration pipeline and executed on demand outside of our direct control, they need to be ready to go. And that typically means that we've taken care of business in terms of managing our environments, making sure that they're stable, and managing our test data. Next is setting up for reliability and fast feedback. If we look at this test environment and data spectrum, many of us are still toward the left end where we have static, shared, stale environments. And that just leads to a lot of test automation adversity, right? Unreliable execution, false negatives, false failures, irrelevant failures is what I like to call them. So failures of our test that have nothing to do with the application at all. So what we need to do, again, as quality leaders is work with our peers to ensure that we can move as far right on this spectrum as possible. We have dynamic, dedicated, and fresh environments for our test suites to execute in. Just a much more automation-friendly situation to be in. Right? Again, we remove a lot of those issues that we see when we're at the far left end of that spectrum. One thing that I was very guilty about early in my career is just start automating. Right? I've given an application, given an environment, maybe given some direction in terms of existing tests, put my head down and start automating. And invariably, I would run into roadblocks, and I would have to code around those roadblocks. And yes, I got it to work, but it looked, it was just spaghetti code by the end sometimes. So it's important before we start attacking test automation problem, especially in new greenfield development, is to think and then do. And I found a good way to think critically about how we're going to implement a test suite is through the test suite canvas. This is something that I first saw in a presentation by Ashley Hunsberger. But the original concept was by Katrina Clokey. And Katrina's got a great blog on DevOps testing, and she's got a book as well on testing in DevOps that has a lot of very applicable resources and techniques. But the idea here is to think about all the kind of peripheral issues that you're going to run into with implementing an automated test suite. Right? It's not just creating a framework and automating the test using that framework. That was weird. Nope. Let me switch. There we go. And this should be done as an organization, not just by a test automation engineer in a vacuum, right? Because you can see a lot of these, certainly dependencies and the constraints, as well as where the tests are going to run, when they're going to run, right? You're touching other parts of the organization in most cases, right? So as an organization going through this process, and it doesn't have to be long, drawn-out process, but maybe a couple hours getting in a room and asking yourselves these questions. You're going to identify a lot of those roadblocks up front and get the right people working on addressing them before you find yourself automated into a corner. Sorry. There we go. And this comes to kind of the crux of my talk. So we have effective test automation. But is that software testing? Right? And I think if we look back at this definition of software testing, critical thinking, experimentation, using our knowledge, using our experience, right? And then a kind of a general definition of automation, I think it's clear probably that test automation is not software testing. Certainly we're automating perhaps the output of those software testing activities. But I often see that organizations are replacing the craft of software testing, so those high-value software testers, with automated test suites, and really not even realizing what they're doing. And the result is just very shallow software testing, where, yes, we can find the superficial problems, we can find the ones that we would have found anyway, but the really hard to find complex problems, because no one's focusing on them anymore, they slip out. Right? So again, as quality leaders, I think understanding the difference here, that test automation is valuable, absolutely. But to equate it to software testing and then risk actually replacing that high-value software testing with an automated test suite is the real risk. One of the ways I think we can, and I'll get back to my soapbox on the craft of software testing in a minute, but one of the ways that I think we can ensure more effective test automation is to broaden our definition of it. And I think in two aspects. The first one is think about all the things that we do as software testers, right? Not just executing scripted test steps, but these are all things that we might do. They can all be automated. We might not be using the same one-size-fits-all tool, or at least it's probably not the best tool for the job for each one of these things, but they can all be automated. I find very often, especially if organizations are struggling with environment or data issues, to automate or to address those issues, like automate test data generation, test data cleanup, environment checks, et cetera, are the most valuable things that we can address first. Because not only are they blocking effective test automation, they're blocking a lot of things in the SDLC. The other aspect is broaden our definition of what a test automation tool is, right? So let's look at all the things that we might use as software testers that could be classified as tools. These are all things that can make our testing more efficient and more effective, right? Again, if we as quality leaders are saying, hey, we've standardized on this tool, and you're going to use it for all your test automation, we've kind of put blinders on the team in terms of helping them broaden the way they think about software testing and test automation, right? But these are all test automation tools. If we keep that definition fairly broad. So I'm going to get back on my soapbox for a minute on the craft of software testing. I think as an industry, and certainly as quality leaders, we all know what these two terms mean: manual testing, automated testing. But I think it has some negative consequences, right? And it starts to maybe be obvious when we look at other things and apply those same two words to it. Do we question our landscaper, whether they're a manual landscaper or an automated landscaper? No, we trust them to use the right tools, the right techniques to do an effective job. But in software testing, right, we have these class levels. How many of you have heard someone say, well, I'm just a manual tester? Really? And as leaders, we generally apply pay gaps to these two terms. I've seen very, very skilled software testers literally save companies because they understand how to find the critical, complex, hard to find problems. On the flip side of that, I've seen automation engineers that have no idea what software testing is. They can code, they could probably launch rockets with Java and Selenium, but they have no idea about software testing. So while I realize I'm fighting an uphill battle, I try as much as I can to not use the term manual testing. You might have noticed I said, testing done by humans. I'm going to lose, but I try. But I think it's important to understand that words matter. By kind of pushing down the role of manual testers, something that's less valuable than automated tester, we're, I think by definition, just kind of sweeping away the craft of software testing. To the point where if all we have is automated testers, well, what are we freeing up? Who are we freeing up to do those high-value testing activities? And to kind of play in the theme of AI, right? As AI is improving our ability to automate, are we going to get to the stage where AI can do effective exploratory testing? Perhaps, but more likely than not, it's going to be, again, little tools, little agents that we can use to assist our exploratory testing. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. Some key takeaways. I know we're almost out of time. We may have a couple minutes for questions. The key thing kind of buried in there is supports our development and business goals. Let's not automate for the sake of automation. And I think, if anything else, the bottom one about understanding that software testing should be much more than the execution of scripted test steps. Yes, that's part of it, but it's really ultimately the low value part of it, if we judge value by the level and the types of problems that we find. All right, I think we have maybe a minute or two for questions. I'm not sure, but I'm always happy to talk about this stuff, and please feel free to reach out to me any of these ways, and I'd be happy to bounce ideas around. So thank you. Questions?
This on? Hello? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I don't know.
Okay.
If
All right, I'll speak loud. I think it's not that the state of automation isn't where we want it to be. It's the perception by the executive suite that it's a lot more valuable than it really is. So I like the talk. I just think you're talking to the wrong audience. Like, it's the C-level you should be talking to, right? CFO, CTO, CEO, saying you're not getting what you think you're getting, and to talk about some of the choices that you've got in your slides.
I think that's fair, although where the work gets done, a lot of the decisions get made is here. And so we need to manage upwards. Yes, they're the ones that are signing the checks, and I see it, there's a lot more choices in certainly tooling and open source frameworks and utilities and libraries. Back in the day when I first got started, it was all commercial tools. And some CTO, CIO had to write a big check to get in the game. And someone made a lot of promises to that person, probably didn't understand all the things that we do in this room, and then tried to manage downward, say, well, testing costs us this much, we've got this many tests. If you automate X% of them, we can cut our head count, or we can reduce our test cycle time, whatever it was. But I think to be involved in those decisions these days and to manage up and say, look, this is the reality of test automation. This is what we can accomplish. This is what we can't accomplish. Yeah, I know there's a lot of myths and things that are perpetuated out there, but this is the reality. And I think if we all understand that reality, we're going to be in a much better place at the end. But it's a good point. You're right. I mean, in this room, I think we understand it, but we need to make sure that those that are making the decisions and writing the checks and own the budgets do as well. Yep.
So your comment about the pay gap or the difference between manual and automation really struck a chord, and I was thinking, what we're paying for is not a manual tester or an automated tester. We're paying for those technical skills, and I liken it to, hiring a backhoe to dig versus hiring a shovel, but it's knowing where to dig. And how can we get people to measure the quality of someone who knows what to test and how to test?
I wish I had a very strong answer. I certainly have an opinion, but I think it depends on the organization. I think it depends on the individual. We need to, again, put the focus on the value of software testing first. And the fact that we're trying to find issues. Yes, automation allows us to move quickly through our pipelines by making sure that we haven't introduced any issues. And there's value in there, but there's also value at the same time in finding the problems that those automated checks can't find. And I think it's kind of a vicious cycle because of that pay gap. There's less people who are willing to put in the time and understand and learn the craft of software testing and grow in that career versus those that say, hey, SDETs are getting paid similar to developers. I'm a decent developer. I think that's where I'm gonna go. And there's a reality of the pay gap too, in that the really good SDETs could probably be really good developers if they wanted to. So you've got to keep the pay there. So I realize there's a reality that we're dealing with as well. But at the same time, I think the pay gap is kind of a barrier for people that could be really good software testers, certainly to stay in there and make it a career. But again, I don't have a great answer. I think there's just so much inertia around that right now. It's hard to break out of. But if we're going to break out of it, it's the value of software testing in general, not just and get the focus away from, hey, if testing is good, automated testing must be better, because that's not necessarily the case.
And AI automated testing is the best.
Of course. That's right. We can all ride off into the sunset. All right. Well, thank you. Any more questions or want to chat about it, I'll be here. Thanks.